Well, good morning. Good morning. And let me say before we start this presentation that the proudest thing in my own view is the fact that my crew had 10 days to prepare. 10 days from the first notice till the day we got underway for this trip. These pictures that I'm about to show you are on a silent film. They were taken during the round-the-world cruise of the Triton. Am I loud enough? Can you hear me? I'm not going to move around. I'm going to stand right here. So anyway, well, to tell the story, I received a note on my desk on the ship. We had been out on operations, and we came in, and I don't know what I was doing, but all of a sudden on my desk appeared this little piece of paper. It said, "Call Washington, D.C., number so-and-so." So I put the call through. And I was told, can you be here in Washington tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.? What for? Just be here. So I was there. Took a bit of doing. I had to change a few things. But anyway, I got on the train and got down there. Walked in to the Pentagon, got to room designated. There was this group of people sitting around a table. I walked in, and the first question was, well, Ned, how's your ship? And I said, it's fine. Has your trials been going okay? Yes, they've been going fine. When do you start your shakedown cruise? And I said, well, it's scheduled to start on the 16th of February. And they said, where are you going? I said, the North Sea. Can you go around the world instead? And I said, gulp. And they said, submerged. And I said, gulp again. And then I thought quickly that chances like this don't come to people very often. So when it comes, you grab it. The right girl walks by, you grab her. But in this case, it was the right cruise, and I grabbed it. I said, yes, sir. I said, fine. And that was essentially the end of the conversation. A few more discussions of things, details. I went back to New London with this secret under my belt. I was told it had to be top secret. Nobody could know about it. And I said, well, look, somebody's got to know about it. I've got to load fuel, got to load, not fuel, got to load provisions, got to take care of all sorts of personal details. How long is it going to take? It'll take about 3 months. Income tax will be due. Automobile license tags have to be taken care of. The sailors have to be told that, look, you can't just go off and leave your wife without some provision for them to not starve to death before you're back. So I've got to tell them something. Well, they said, well, we'll trust you to make up a story, but you can't tell them what you're really doing. Well, all the way back to New London, Connecticut, I sat there deciding how I was going to carry out this order, and finally decided I had to disobey it to some extent. So I called a conference of all the officers and told them, and swore them all to absolute secrecy. And I know that a couple of them had to tell some of the sailors, particularly the navigator, because he had to get charts for all this trip. And, ships are not fitted out with charts to go clean around the world all the time. You have to draw the charts that you're expecting to need for the thing. So we had to go and lay out the whole, get the charts for the whole business, and then the Navy Department sent a message, and they wanted a noon position for our entire trip around the world. So we had to navigate the trip in advance, plot each position, and then the deal was, if I get off that position, we had to send a message. If we were on the position, we didn't have to send a message. So that was the situation. Briefly, the Triton was built in 1959, put in commission in 59. She was then the world's biggest submarine. You see a picture of her, several in fact. She had 2 reactors. She was, at that time, supposed to be the fastest submarine, which turned out not to be quite true. There was one that was faster. And she had the biggest crew, and of course, I proudly claim that I was the senior submarine skipper in the United States Navy and the whole world for a short time. I invite you to admire this handsome, good-looking young captain that you'll see in a few minutes, and his pretty wife. And I might point out that pretty wife cost me something. I described our departure and saying she had a red scarf on her head. Well, the pictures proved it was blue, and that cost me something, which you'll see in due course. Now, if you'll start the movies, I am the soundtrack, so I will have to carry on as we go along. closer to this. All right. I give up. I'll hold it right here. Like this. Well, I am not a singer, but I'll try. Well, as I say, the proud thing in my view was that we got this ship ready in 10 days, which in effect shows what the Navy can do if it really has to. Now, here is the crew standing on deck of the submarine. There's the Triton sail. There she is. They have just had morning quarters, and we've just told them that, all right, fellas, if you haven't gotten ready to go on this trip yet, it's too late to make any difference. We're on our way, and you're not getting back ashore. Pictures taken during a day or so prior to it, loading provisions. We loaded provisions the standard old way, as the way they used to load them during the war, down between the torpedo tubes. This is the torpedo tube firing ram right here, the shiny thing. Here's a box of apples or something coming down. That's being loaded in the proper storeroom. But we had the ship simply loaded with provisions, loaded for 120 days. We estimated the trip would take 83 days. I deliberately didn't do it for 80 days. I wish now I had. We could have done it in 80 days just as well. Good friend of mine, Jim Calvert, saying goodbye to us. And here's the crew waving to their friends ashore, saying goodbye again. Most of the friends are just New London Electric Boat Company shipyard workers. This gentleman is a civilian scientist who has just discovered that he isn't going to be home for 3 months. He's a bit woebegone about that. And I'm here saying goodbye to the most important lady in my life. And, of course, the last thing you do before you get underway is bring the last load of mail over and get rid of it and pick up what they have for you. Here goes the gangway. And the next thing will be to start working on the lines, releasing the after lines and pulling in on the forward lines. And we'll very soon, in about a minute, be underway. The Triton was a hard ship to handle because she was so long and narrow. Despite the two reactors, they were one in front of the other, so the two propeller shafts were quite close together. We are here proceeding out the Thames River in New London, going at slow speed, although she's making quite a wake. But the thing that you have to notice is how much power this ship has. Now, as she drives forward, her bow dips down, and the wake kicks up quite a bit. We're now making about 15 knots. It's not much, but the ship will go 30 knots. And one of the things that I'm very happy about is that I'm one of the few submariners who was able to make the complete transition from diesel-powered subs into nuclear subs. And believe me, it's a sensation. Well, here's the Triton model, of course, purpose being to give me an opportunity to describe her. She's 447 feet long, which is 2/3 the length of this ship. She's 37 feet beam, draws 27 feet of water, which I think is more than this ship. That's on the surface. The total height from keel to the top of the sail is, as I recall, 55 feet. And when the periscope is fully raised, the top of the periscope is 75 feet above the keel. So the maximum submergence depth that we can go when we raise the periscope is 75 feet. Otherwise, the top of the scope goes underwater. Bow planes here. Down below the sonar gear, we had the latest, newest sonar in that bulge down there. This is not the way you expect a submarine to be built, but this ship was built to be a surface ship as well as a submarine. So we had many surface ship characteristics. Crew 175 men, as I remember. We had 8 scientists aboard with us on this particular trip. One of the things we discovered is that when you go deep and you don't cavitate any longer, your propellers actually drive through as if they're driving through cement. There is no slippage, in other words. I found my dead reckoning navigation was almost meticulously accurate. All I needed to do was to take the number of RPM, or number of revolutions made by the propellers during the period elapsed, and multiply by the time, the distance, 13.6 feet every time they turn, and that gave me the exact distance we'd traveled. These are interior shots. This is a shot of the control cubicle for number 2 reactor. Control cubicle for number 2 reactor. This is a steering station. Previously, I think we showed a control room sequence, which I'd skipped over because I was talking about something else. This is the navigator, my executive officer, navigating in the conning tower. And over there, just in the small of his back, is something gray, which is the shoulder of the helmsman. That shows you how you use space on board a submarine. And don't forget, this was the world's biggest submarine. This was hitherto a classified picture, a secret portion of the electronic controls. We'd been underway for 2 days when I decided it was time to announce to the crew what we were really up to. So here's the loudspeaker. Here I am making the speech, telling them that, fellas, we're not going to the North Sea after all. It was all a game. We are really going to go around the world submerged. And we're not coming up. We had Joe Roberts on board with us from the National Geographic, and he actually, he kept asking me, when are you going to make the announcement? When are you going to make the announcement? And I finally said, okay, I guess I'll do it now. And he ran around and got his camera, and this is one of the results. Well, the crew was nonplussed, but they were delighted. And we had all sorts of charts that immediately came out. This was drawn afterward, but anyway, it's what we were doing. And that's our route laid out in the sort of pink lines. I will move over. This is our route, and here, this gray line is Magellan's route. We followed his route as closely as we could with some necessary diversions. And as you can see, up here in the upper right of the screen, we're going right through the area now where the Triton went some years ago. Just to prove that we were a little bit better off than Magellan, here is the Triton, and here's Magellan's fleet of 5 ships. There's one of them, the San Antonio, the biggest ship, his supply ship. The next biggest was the Trinidad. The San Antonio was 130 tons, the Trinidad 120. The Victoria was the only one that got back from this trip. She was 90 tons. The fourth, next to smallest, was the Concepcion, about 85 tons. And finally, the Santiago, which was lost on the coast of South America before they got to the Straits of Magellan. She was only 50 tons. Now, you can imagine going around the world in a fleet of ships like that. As they were going through the Straits of Magellan, the San Antonio decided this was too much for them. She had all the supplies. She knew she could make it. So she turned around and went home, just reporting that Magellan and everybody else had been lost. It wasn't for 3 years until the Victoria got back that they found out what a crumb this guy was. As I understand it, they did take away his medals. Naturally, many charts showed up, most of them from the National Geographic, and here we are charting our course. Our first landfall, we went straight southeast. Our first landfall was a place marked on the charts, St. Peter and St. Paul rocks. In the middle of the Atlantic, it's just an outcropping of land coming up, and it was a good place to collect guano fertilizer. Well, we put the periscope up, and Navigator was a little bit concerned that he was going to be on target, but he was indeed right on target. He put the thing up, and there she was, a little white dot in the distance. And here is St. Peter and St. Paul rocks. I've seen it twice in my life. This was the first time, and I think the last time will be also in the same movie, because we determined that this would be the beginning and end of our official circumnavigation. And in order that nobody could say we had missed by 10 feet of completely going around the world, we circumnavigated St. Peter and St. Paul rocks in a clockwise direction this time. When we came back, we circumnavigated again in a counterclockwise direction, thus to make darn sure that nobody could say we hadn't done it. Then we headed south, and almost immediately were visited by a very fearsome deputation. The equator was right down there, and King Neptune and Davy Jones and the royal baby and the Queen and the royal prosecutor all came aboard through the forward torpedo tubes and accosted me and announced that they were going to put the crew on trial. Well, I had sort of had some warning they might be coming, so I dressed formally for them. You see I have my sword on. This was not necessarily to defend the crew. Now, one thing I noticed, whenever a sailor puts on this kind of an outfit, which he does for crossing the line, he also always puts on a cigar. And I think there's a little psychology to that. Well, there's a tribunal, and the guilty pollywogs, of course, are forced to defend themselves and plead guilty. And they're always given a fair trial, and they're always sentenced. And the first thing you have to do is kiss the royal baby's belly, which is well plastered with grease and stuff. And of course, as a disinterested bystander, I had to help them out a little bit. Well, previous to the landing King Neptune. I had been visited by a deputation wanting to know if it was okay to cut hair. And on a previous trip, the same King Neptune had been aboard, and I had forbidden it because you're going to be in Rio de Janeiro shortly. And I said, I don't want my crew going ashore in Rio looking like a bunch of zombies with these strange haircuts. But this time I said, well, by the time we get back, it'll all be grown back. This is these two guys are very good friends. The barber and the other fellow, Bob Brody, the lieutenant, and you can watch this. Our friend wasn't expecting it, but he's getting a little grease and hair on his hands. Well, we also had religious services, which we did every Sunday for the Catholics and the non-Catholics. And it was entirely voluntary, and I was rather surprised and pleased, of course, to see that there was a steady attendance. They were always the same people. But there we were. The preacher here is our supply officer. He is not a preacher, but he did his best with the equipment we had, and I think it was fairly well handled. During the trip down from St. Peter and St. Paul Rocks, we were running down the coast of South America here, and it was during this period that one of our sailors began developing kidney stones. Kidney stones is a pretty tough thing. We had a full-fledged doctor on board. He was a surgeon. I said to him, look, what can you do? And he said, nothing. I said, well, what can we do? And he said, well, if it gets worse, you have to get help. There's just no way I can handle it. I won't touch it, but I'm telling you that it could be pretty serious. So we sent a message describing the situation, and he had his third attack. I ordered reversal of course and went to full speed. We had been going at 21 knots. We went up to 30 and headed for Montevideo. I knew that the cruiser Macon was up there, and I sent a message saying, I hope the Macon can get underway and meet us and, in effect, rescue our trip. Here we are with all the details going on at full speed, and you have to believe it when that ship puts on the power. It just goes like it's just impossible to not be thrilled. Anyway, there we were. The diversion was 2,000 miles. And then, of course, the question was, how do we get him out without surfacing? Well, I had a deputation of sailors come to see me, and they said, look, he's a qualified scuba diver. Why don't we just shove him out the escape hatch? Well, I had to veto that one. I said, boy, how will I ever explain that one to her? But anyway, what we did was we locked him out, made an airlock of the... This is Cape Horn. This is Cape Horn, if this thing is working now. And as you can see, in the old days, things were a little different. This is the Flying Dutchman rounding Cape Horn, and he's having his problems with his nuclear-powered engines, and he's half submerged already without any intent. One of his reactors has sprung a leak, as you can see, and here's somebody up there trying to work on the thing. Well, all joking aside, those guys had quite a job. We, on the other hand, simply went by, submerged, taking pictures of Cape Horn. These pictures were actually taken, I believe, by Alan Billiards in about 1915 or something like that. As you can see there, that's quite a way to travel. It's almost the way it is with this ship, isn't it? Well, the tradition was, and it still is, if you try to cross Cape Horn and see it, that's bad news, and it's going to result in bad luck very doggone soon, for pretty obvious reasons. You don't want to see it, because if you do, it's tough luck. You're going to run ashore. But I decided we'd change the tradition and have some good luck. I ordered that everybody on the ship come up and take a look at Cape Horn. Thus, through the periscope, of course, we would create a new tradition that if you look at Cape Horn deliberately, with intent, you'll have good luck the rest of your seafaring career. And the only miscalculation I made was that 175 men coming up one after another, even using both periscopes, took a while, and I had to make 5 crossings of Cape Horn. So we went back and forth 5 times, and everybody was happy, and off we went. One of the ones was to do something about the ocean currents. Actually, I wasn't that interested in it, but we used this as a means to sort of announce our passage. And this actually, they set this up for me, and I filled out these so-called bottle papers, but I didn't fill them out with the normal stuff. I put on there that this was the USS Triton on a secret mission. And here they are being put in the bottles, and of course, normally they're just tossed over the side. Well, you can't toss a bottle over the side of a submerged submarine. So what we did was we put it in the submerged signal ejector, which is a device like a torpedo tube. There it is. You put a bottle in, shut the inner door very carefully, and then you open the outer door, and with a little boost of air, you shove the bottle out into the sea. We were careful always to do this when the ship was at periscope depth so there wouldn't be too much pressure on the bottle. And we left 135 of these bottles all around the ocean. And some of them have come back, actually. Not many, though. Well, we rounded Cape Horn out into the Pacific, and our next stop was, as I recall, Easter Island. At this point, we'd been having some trouble. Our fathometer had broken down, and we couldn't tell the depth of water any longer, and I was in some concern as to what to do. If we hit bottom, it would be hard to explain. Knowing the caliber of our admiral up in New London, however, I decided that the thing I wouldn't do was be to report this to him, because if I did, he might abort the mission. If I put the responsibility on him, in other words. So I held the responsibility on myself and didn't report it. And we did all sorts of special means to get the depth of water, and were quite accurate about it. So we had no problems. Of course, I was very cautious. At any rate, we got pictures of Easter Island. We thought we had seen some of the heads there, but couldn't be sure, and I did not bring the ship in close enough. I didn't have my confidence up yet to bring in any closer. At any rate, now here we are crossing the Pacific, and as we crossed to a point nearest to Pearl Harbor, we had an aloha party on board ship. Now, one of the traditions of the sailors at sea is that they're always starving. They have, they eat shoe leather off the masts, and they catch all the rats and bugs and birds and eat all that. And as you can see, we're carrying on the tradition as it's supposed to be. This is a full Hawaiian luau prepared by our ship's cooks. One of the things of a Hawaiian luau, as some of you I'm sure know full well, is that there's lots of poi. Well, the poi wasn't very popular, but the steaks and the fried shrimp and the chicken and all that good stuff was. And of course, morale is always a problem. So Navy ships have been dry since 1914, when Josephus Daniels put out a certain dictum. But as you can see, we're fairly happy. And I take no responsibility for this, except that I did it. And we did have good morale. Well, now we're crossing the rest of the Pacific. You know, you don't see much of the Pacific here, just a bunch of dots on the scale. But anyway, we're now approaching Guam. There we come to Guam. One of our sailors had been in the Navy for, I think it was 9 years, and he had enlisted from Guam, and he'd never been back. Prior to hitting Guam, we had a ceremony for the old Triton. The Triton here, my ship, was named after submarine number 201 that was lost during the war after a very fine record. And we have her bell. There it is. You'll see it in another picture. And I am here reading a special prepared statement that we'd written and broadcast to the whole ship. And this time I am dressed formally. One doesn't do this very often in a submarine, but I felt it was appropriate for this occasion. And then, having done this, honor guard, as you see, ordered all hands to attention. All hands stand up, face forward. Those on watch as well as those not on watch. And all hands did, and we fired a salute. Salute in the submarine is what they call a water slug. It's a torpedo tube full of water that's ejected at high velocity and makes a big rumble, but of course doesn't hurt anything, except on wary fish who might be right in front. Here's a Triton's bell, and here's a picture of the Triton from which it came, from whom we inherited this bell. She was 300 feet long, had a crew of 75 people. I had a good record, as I said, and was lost in the war. As a matter of fact, I was very nearby in the old Trigger, identical submarine. We heard the depth charges that sank the Triton. Well, the next stop was Guam. I got slightly ahead of myself a minute ago. And as we approached Guam, we wondered what we would do. First place, where was Guam? And my executive officer, navigator, being rather cocky at this point, I've given him a bad time, but he just says, look, if you look where I tell you to, why, you'll see Guam right where it's supposed to be. And indeed, there it was. There it is. This is the peninsula on the right of the harbor. This is Orote Peninsula, I believe. And over on the left is the other side. And in between is the entrance to the harbor of I think it's Agana Harbor. And young Carbolito, as I say, had enlisted in the Navy from Guam and hadn't been back for 9 years. So we did the traditional thing in the submarine force, gave him a periscope liberty. That's why there's no pictures of Carbolito with the periscope or any pictures of what he saw, because he had the periscope for 1 full hour looking at what he thought was his family home. I can't be sure that it is his family home, but he said it was, and he was happy. Big smile on his face. When we got back from the trip, incidentally, I was able to work a big deal with Pan American Airways, and they shipped him all the way out to Guam on 60 days, which he spent working for his father and his dad's service station. The Triton was a radar picket, and here we're carrying on an exercise here showing the radar picket function. You detect incoming aircraft and spot them on your scopes, and then you radio to the fleet where they're coming from, course and speed, and all that sort of business. This was devised at the end of World War II when the kamikazes were making such depredations on our ships. We had destroyers out there on picket duty, and that was almost a suicide assignment. If you went out there, the kamikazes came in, they saw a destroyer all by itself, they knew what it was there for, and they attacked it. Well, the idea then was, let's fix it so this destroyer, this picket, can submerge. So that was the basic purpose of the Triton, to have this radar picket function. Of course, the development of radar and the communication link-ups that have since come on, have made it totally unnecessary, and so this particular function no longer is used by the Navy. It's all done by radar control inside the aircraft carriers and the Aegis-class cruisers. But anyway, that's what we had at that time. Now, these pictures were rather clearly not taken from you may recall, I think it was my lecture you showed you one slide of a gun going off at night. Well, I've seen guns go off like this at night, and let me tell you, if you're not protecting your eyes, you're blind. And you'll stay blind for a perceptible time, like maybe a minute or two, gradually get your vision back. So what you're seeing now is the flashes that these people were seeing, but if you're doing your job, you're looking away. You're protecting your eyes because you've got to aim the doggone guns. You're not looking around and being a spectator. You can be a spectator if you want, but you'll only spectate the first one. After that, you don't. This is the Battle of Surigao Strait, where our old battleships, restored from the attack on Pearl Harbor, gave it back to the Japanese. And here is our track into Surigao Strait. We took samples of water all the way through, and I sent a sample to Admiral Oldendorf saying that I detected a bunch of rusty ions in this water, and I thought sure it was from sunken Japanese battleships. He was very grateful for this testimonial. We came through, I'm getting behind now, we came through around Bohol Island and into Hilu Tagnan Channel, which is shown here, and this, of course, is an artist's conception because I didn't dare take pictures of it and didn't want to waste any time and take my mind off what I was really doing. But up on the other end of Hilu Tagnan Channel is Magellan Bay, where Magellan lost his life in 1521. We were looking for the monument that had been placed to Magellan, and I think it'll show up in a moment or two. This is a rather hairy operation in shallow water, not too shallow, but shallow. There's a monument. You can see it there on the right of the periscope crosshair. And we were, cruising inside the bay. This was a populous little bay, many fishing boats and pleasure boats as well. There's something going by with a black sail, and there's some with very gaily colored sails. They're all, of course, outrigger types, as we've seen. These chaps all seem to have sails, except one that I'll show you in a moment. I was looking through here, and suddenly, as I turned the periscope around, there he was. And, I pulled the scope down, and then I sneaked it up, and he's still there looking at me, wondering what's going on, and I was looking at him from 40 feet underneath, saying to myself, what do I do now? I'm supposed to be undetected. Well, Joe Roberts was there, and he begged me to let him take a picture. So I finally did. And then the National Geographic sent off to Cebu to see if they could find this guy, and they came back with this fellow who claimed to be the one. He's the son of the chief of police of Cebu, and there he is again. I frankly doubt if he's really the same guy, because looking at his canoe and at the canoe that I have pictures of there there's some differences that, to me, are significant, such as the shape of the outrigger, for example. At any rate, there he is. So then we decided we better hightail out of there. There's our last shot of the monument. That's as close as I was able to get. I understand it was under repair and is now somewhat better looking than that the upper part has been removed. But anyway, we headed out, and he, of course, headed the other way. I am told that he actually didn't report it at all because he thought he'd seen a sea monster, and when he was out fishing, when he looked down there, he saw the biggest darn fish he'd ever seen in his life. Big black hull maneuvering around underneath him. Here's some more bottle papers. We now changed our thing slightly. We wrote, actually that's my hand, Ave nobilis dux iterum factum est. Hail, noble captain, it is done again. Actually, I had a mistake in my Latin. I said sactum instead of factum, but I got corrected as soon as we got back to the States. And, of course, this went in the bottle papers and all that. 1960. Trip was completed, of course, in 1960. Then we headed down through Macassar Strait, through the Celebes Sea, and here's the island of Bali, which is where we are right now. Now, we mentioned the bullhead. The bullhead was sunk right here, right, as a matter of fact, right there. And her skipper was a close friend of mine. So as we went through there, we held a little service for him. I later discovered that there was one other man on board who had been aboard the bullhead, and I wish I'd realized it at the time, because we could have done it together. But anyway, we did. On through Lombok Strait. And here's a digression. We are now demonstrating some of the scientific things we were doing. We took samples of the water all the way around. I think it was every 4 hours for the complete round-the-world trip, we took a sample. So this young scientist type was getting his sample at that moment, which he's putting in a box, ship back to the Navy Hydrographic Office. He also recorded other data about the water at that time, temperature, depth that was taken, and so forth. We also had, one of our primary questions was to calculate the gravity of the Earth. For guidance of space missiles, ballistic missiles, it's necessary to have an accurate measurement of gravity, and the only way to do it and really be sure you've got it right is to have a single gravity measuring device go clean around the world and come back to the starting point and prove that its measurements are all correct. So that's what was being done. Here we are. This is actually in our CIC, the radar intercept place, and he's working his gravitational measurement instruments. They've had another submarine, the Archerfish, which is a diesel-powered sub, and that's been her primary mission for many years, cruising around all around the world taking these various measurements. I think that's been finished now. But we just made a one-shot trial, and I'm informed that it was quite useful and of course, added to our sum total of knowledge. The fact is, I later discovered that that wasn't the main reason for our trip. As we passed out through Lombok Strait, taking shots on both sides, here, incidentally, is the island of Lombok, which is on the other side of the strait from Bali. And I think the next shot, well, all right, after that, we'll see Bali. We saw this little sailboat, and not having anything else to do, I decided we would run a submerged torpedo attack on this sailboat. So, the world's biggest submarine with a crew of 175 guys torpedoed this poor little boat at least 50 times. And we went around at least twice, as I recall, taking pictures. And as far as I know, they never knew that we were there. You can sure see the difference between them and us. And whatever they were doing. The whole family of people on board looked like about 10 or 15. Here is Bali. And that is, I think, Mount Agnun. And it is said by the sailors to be a nearly perfect representation of a woman's breast. That I cannot attest to. We're now passing out past Bali. There's a few small islands off there. And then we headed out into the Indian Ocean, north and west of Australia. As we went through here, a rather strange phenomenon developed. It looks like land over there on the right, but actually look at it a little more carefully, and it isn't land. It's a bore, B-O-R-E, a bore. It's where the water of Lombok Strait came out and intersected the water of the Indian Ocean, and the salinity is very different, and the results are that your buoyancy of your ship changes a lot. Well, I decided I'd try an experiment. So the officer of the deck suddenly called up and said he needed speed, and I said, well, you got control, you do what you think you have to do. And he promptly lost control, and the ship began to sink. As we hit the Indian Ocean, which was much less saline than the water up north, the ship lost a lot of buoyancy. We went down a couple of 100 feet before I acceded to his frantic requests for speed, which, of course, brought us back up. In the Indian Ocean, we were required to have a no-smoking test, put out the smoking lamp for a period of 2 weeks. So here's the rather solemn conference that we held. You notice the hair is growing back fairly well, but the conference was being held on how do we employ this no-smoking business? How do we put it across to the crew, and how do we convince them that indeed they can't smoke for 2 weeks? So all these high conferences were being held, but anyway, I finally gave the order, and we put out the smoking lamp. Well, here's the ship's doctor. Having disposed of his first problem, kidney stones, he's now measuring air pressure and air temperature and the amount of oxygen and nicotine in the air. He was an inveterate smoker, and it was he who reported to me after 2 days that the ship couldn't stand it anymore. That something had to be done, or there'd be another mutiny in the U.S. Navy. So I said, all right, I gave up, made an official report to this effect. In the process, however, I had my own revenge. I went through the ship smoking a cigar, and everybody saw me, and I said, I'm the captain, and I can smoke, and you can't. Well, that didn't last long. Some of the people have asked me what our crew did with their spare time. There really wasn't much spare time, but there was a little, and some projects were taken on. Here's one. This chap is quite adept at his leather work, and this fellow, we called him Rembrandt after this picture. It's by the numbers, as you can see. But it's not a bad picture. He's doing all right. And, of course, the chaps with their model airplanes. And this fellow, named Jim Smith, turned out to be quite an accomplished artist. And here's a model he's made of the Chief Fitzgerald, who was, incidentally, the other man who'd been aboard the Bullhead. And that Jim Smith has been a representative to the state legislature from Florida, and is apparently quite a successful businessman, and still does this as a hobby. Well, our next landfall was Cape of Good Hope, and we celebrated this re-entry into the Atlantic Ocean with the standard penurious manner in which we'd been accustomed. You know, there was one sailor on board the ship who gained 30 pounds under my sight, and then the next time I saw him, he'd changed his watch schedule, and he'd lost the 30 pounds. I asked him how come. He said, well, I just quit eating. Anyway, getting him on a different watch schedule is what did it for him, but these chaps aren't losing weight very fast today. Here's Dr. Wybrew. He was the short man with the trench coat that you saw on deck as we were leaving. He's a psychologist, and he had a bunch of volunteers on board ship to give him their reactions every day. So they were required to fill out these charts, and they came in and he interviewed them. And here's one of the interviewees. And I recognize him too. His name is Marbury, and Marbury was the man who put out the ship's paper. We put out a ship's paper every day. We ran out of paper, as a matter of fact, so we could only make 10 copies, and they were passed around. But anyway, it turned out that the best thing in the whole ship's newspaper was Snoopy, a copy of Snoopy, a cartoon of Snoopy. And poor old Marbury had trouble because all the sailors tried to rob his book of Snoopy, to get an advanced look at the adventures. So I had to exercise my own, at his request, my own authority, and I made Snoopy top secret and kept him locked up in the ship's safe. The only way even Marbury could get him out was to come and ask for him, and I religiously refrained from sneaking a peek ahead, except a couple times. Well, here's Wybrew with his charts, and I think his findings were earth-shaking. He found that on field days, which was every Friday when they had to clean the ship up, people felt a little less enthusiastic, and on Saturdays they felt better because Sunday was a holiday. Unusual reactions. But anyway, here's his chart of how they felt. He's got fatigue, headaches, insomnia, and nostalgia are all charted out for the ship. And I don't know where that chart is. I'd like to see it now. Well, we kept these charts going all the time, and as we're approaching the end of our cruise, we had now crossed the bottom of Africa, and we're coming up through the Atlantic again, past Ascension Island, past St. Helena, and heading on up to rendezvous again at St. Peter and St. Paul's Rocks. It was at this point that we had a really serious casualty back aft. The hydraulic system simply exploded. We lost our stern planes. The ship was making 20 knots. And with complete loss of the stern planes, by quick and decisive action back aft, before anybody got back there to straighten it out, we had the ship back under control. So I was very proud of our lads to put them up for medals, and they got them, too. Well, here we are again at St. Peter and St. Paul Rocks, having had our casualty, and now we're going around in the other direction, proving that, indeed, we had come back to where we started from. Our total distance at this point was 31,000 miles, some 26,000 nautical miles, as I recall. To celebrate it, we had a beard contest. You don't know what you can do to keep your sailors happy, but you have a beard contest, and here's some of the candidates. This young chap, here's the exec. He had a rather fancy one. The doctor just let his grow. He didn't pay much attention. And, of course, Rembrandt has a pretty good beard. And I was unanimously acclaimed as the judge as to who was going to have the best beard and get the prize. Well, I already made up my mind that the barber here was going to get the prize. His name was Kolar, and he was a pretty good barber, as well as whatever else his gun is made, I think. But somehow or other he fell asleep before the contest, and he didn't get there, and I had to choose honestly. And I couldn't pick him. I didn't dare to send for him to get him up and bring him forward and give him the prize, for fear that would give away my own thing. So I gave the prize to this other fellow who was sitting in the barber's chair at that time. Forgotten his name, but it didn't do him any good. I remember shortly after we got back, he got in a bad automobile wreck and was really badly injured. Well, having passed St. Peter and St. Paul Rocks, we then headed up past the Azores to the islands of the Canary Islands, and here is the city of Tenerife. City of Santa Cruz on the island of Tenerife. We passed fairly close to here. I was looking for the harbor described both Magellan's voyage and later in the history of Horatio Nelson, where they had a little sort of a dry dock and a docking place, but I couldn't identify any such of a thing. It's long gone, obviously. To see all the lights coming on as people were waking up, and then you saw cars driving along with the lights on, and then as the dawn broke, the lights gradually went out. And this is when we had enough light. This was the picture we took. Then on up to Cadiz, Spain, where we had a special mission to deliver the plaque that we had designed for presentation to Spain. That was another one of our missions, which incidentally we designed. We designed the plaque. How to get the plaque first to the ship from the destroyer, bless it properly because it was made during our absence, and then delivered. So the destroyer sent this boat with mail and a couple of doctors to check us out for continued sanity, and the plaque. And we did the same deal as we had done previously with our man with kidney stones. We broached the ship and had the deck awash. Now, watch this sequence very carefully because it was totally unexpected and actually rather hazardous. But the coxswain is not very experienced. He's not doing a very good job. Here comes a couple of men aboard. Here comes a wave rolling over the deck. Now watch this as he guns his boat unwisely, and he clear up on deck. One fellow jumped overboard. Two fellows fell overboard, and one guy jumped on deck of the ship. And the bottom of the boat was stove in. So he made it back to his ship all right, but with some damage. And it's entirely his fault, too. Anyway, here's our plaque, which we had, as I say, we designed in the States, left behind with instructions to have it made, and it was then delivered to us as a lovely thing, all shiny. It has the dates there. And here is the presentation of the plaque. This was brought into the city of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is where Magellan set forth on his trip in 1519. Here's the American delegation arriving. The American ambassador, John Davis Lodge, coming out of his car. There he is. He's Henry Cabot Lodge's younger brother. Ambassador to Spain. Very popular ambassador, incidentally. He spoke Spanish fluently. And his wife, I think, was Spanish. At any rate, here is the ceremony now. The city fathers are welcoming our plaque. There's a bunch of Navy people there from the embassy, no doubt. And here's John Davis Lodge announcing that the plaque is being presented, and there he is unveiling it. And I proudly say that the plaque was designed, built, and done by the U.S. Navy. And as a matter of fact, I had a hand in it myself. And that is now hanging on the wall of the City Hall, I believe, at Sanlúcar de Barrameda. We had several replicas made of it for various places, but that, of course, is the official presentation. And then, back across the Atlantic again. Our total trip was 41,000 and something miles. But, of course, this part is no longer around the world. We're just traveling now, but we stayed submerged anyway. And the helicopter came. I was instructed to be ready, and it took me off my ship right off Rehoboth Beach and brought me and a bunch of reporters into the White House. This was all a surprise, but naturally very acceptable. Stepping down out of the helicopter now. It's amazing. Some people still think those propeller rotors might bend down and whack them on the head. As you'll see, they're bending over, but I think I was able not to do that. And they took me right into the White House room. I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, the president showed up. And of course, I knew he was coming, but I was caught by surprise at that moment. On my right here is Admiral Rickover. The newspapers announced that he wasn't there, but you see a picture of him, and there's a young lady who I thought had a red hat, but she got even. She's got a new hat. They awarded me a decoration, and they also awarded a decoration to the entire ship, which we wear from then on out. Presidential Unit Citation with the Round the World clasp. And of course, it was a state of great befuddlement and confusion to me. Very happy to see Ingrid. And they had us up there posing with a model of the ship. And she, at this point, suddenly leaned over and whispered something to me. And I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Well, my heel has come off my shoe." Well, of course, one thing a skipper will not do is permit somebody else to bring his ship back into harbor. So they flew me back out to the Triton. I had my homecoming a day later. But I went back to the Triton, went aboard, and brought her into New London. So here we are as the ship is coming in. That flag, incidentally, flew from my father's cruiser, the Memphis, when it was cast ashore in a tidal wave. I happened to run into the fellow who had it and asked him to send it to me without telling me. I couldn't tell him why, of course, but he did. And so we took it with us and flew it on the way back. And here's the welcoming committee, all with a bunch of homemade signs, obviously. Anyway, it's a very pleasant thing. Now, one of the contretemps, you always have to be ready for a contretemps. First place, it was raining, but that didn't bother us. We stood up there anyway. And the second thing is that the Secretary of the Navy was supposed to come and present the ship with the unit citation and give a medal to the sailor who had salvaged that accident back aft, and he didn't show up. Turned out that the guide that he had misled the way, and he was still in his car trying to find New London. Well, so what do you do in a case like this? Well, here were all the families ashore yelling at their men, saying, "Glad to see you back," and here are all the men on board counting the children to see if there were the extra ones present that they had been told to expect. So there's only one thing that I knew to do, and I ordered that there would be liberty on the dock. For anybody who wanted to go ashore could go on the dock and greet his friends, but they were to stand by within sound of the ship's horn, whistle. And that when we blew the horn, they were to come running back and get back on deck as if they had never left. Well, by golly, they all did, all except one. And that one was a special story, too, because we had what was called a familygrams. Every once in a while, you get a familygram, and usually the familygram said that mother had been to the hospital and mother and child were doing fine, and so on. But there was this one sailor who had been haunting the radio room for about a week and a half or so, and there was no familygram. So he didn't know what was going on. He was getting kind of anxious. And there he was looking for his wife on the dock, and she wasn't on the dock either. And then he was really concerned. So I had the executive officer check up, and sure enough, guess where she was? In the hospital. As I said, pointed out somewhere, the best possible excuse for missing the return of the ship. So what do you do then? Well, once in a while you have to break another law, and I did. Ship's official car sent there for official use only was commandeered, and this sailor was put in the car, and the driver was given instructions to take him to the hospital. And so you taxpayers among us have helped a little bit in this particular case. It probably cost us each a tenth of a penny or something like that. Anyway, that was the end of our trip. We left on the 16th of February and got back on the 10th of May. Total distance traveled, I think, was 41,000 and something miles. Time was 83 days and 19 hours. And, of course, just before we got in, I made a speech to the crew saying, look, you know, the only limitation we have, this being a nuclear-powered ship, the only limitation we have is provisions. And we loaded the ship for 120 days, and we have been fairly good about our expenditure of food. So we have enough food that if we go on half rations, we can go for another trip around the world. Well, that wasn't a very popular statement. And the ship's newspaper came out with a cartoon the very next day. And it shows somebody resembling me standing on top of the conning tower, announcing that we're going around a second time. And the whole crew is standing on deck, diving over at the side. So that is the Tritons Around the World cruise. That happened, believe it or not, in 1960, 28 years ago. And that's, you know. Anyway, I'll be happy to answer questions and all that, but I have one more thing I want to say. One more thing I want to say, and that is to tell you about Run Silent, Run Deep. They're going to show it this afternoon at 2 o'clock. I want to introduce it because there's some things about the movie that really bother me. It's a great movie. It's got Clark Gable in it, Burke Lancaster, and all that, and it's a favorite for the television late-night shows. But the trouble with the doggone thing is that they do violence to the Navy. For example, in the very beginning, and this why anybody let this go by? Incidentally, I was supposed to be able to approve the script, and they never sent it to me when I complained. They said, well, you were at sea, and we couldn't reach you. And he was eager to reach me every couple of days with a letter. You know, they could have reached me, but they didn't try. And they got a technical advisor who was a submariner, but he didn't know his rear end from third base, as far as I'm concerned. And anyway, what they did was that the very first scene in the movie, you watched it, just plain isn't true. It can't be true, and it wasn't written in the book either. But they invented this thing. And what you see is Clark Gable in the movie. And all of a sudden, Clark Gable is depth charged. And the next thing, he is in a rubber boat helping pick up survivors. And it says it happened off the Bungo Sweeto. And there's a Japanese destroyer comes charging in. Well, I ask you, how come 1 year later, as the movie begins, Clark Gable is back in Pearl Harbor? This didn't happen to anybody during the war. If you were taken prisoner, you stayed in prison. It was in the War of 1812 that people could be exchanged. And they go back, and once their parole was exchanged, they did war like gentlemen in those days. They would even send you back home, and you'd be on parole. You couldn't fight until somebody else had been captured on the other side and his parole taken. Then they would exchange paroles. So these two characters, both at home with their families, would then be free to go back and fight some more. But that's not the way we did it in World War II. If you were captured, you went to a prison camp, and Clark Gable never made it back to Pearl Harbor. Well, anyway, that's in the movie. So when you see it, don't blame me. Okay. Any questions? I'll be happy to. Yes, sir. Sad to say, the Triton is in mothballs at Norfolk, tied up to the dock and looking rather woebegone. We have the plaque inside still there. Somebody has stolen that bell. I'm furious. Somebody has gotten away with it. Yep, don't know what happened. But anyway, I started a little move to bring her to Washington to set her up as a memorial, and I think they're going to bring a submarine there, but I believe they plan to bring the first Polaris submarine in, and I'm opposed to that. I'd rather see mine, but what can you do? Yes, sir. Yes. The refueling interval today for a nuclear ship is 15 years. 15 years. Now, when they built the Triton, we could run for about 2 years, 3 years. And this is a technically tricky thing, but what you do is you put boron in the reactor, and boron is burnable by the reactor operation. So as you burn your boron, and you're burning your nuclear, your active material at the same time, they are so spaced out and so put in there that they burn at approximately the same rate, and you can load that reactor just as much as you want. So now it's 15 years. So when you refuel your ship, it's a major overhaul. Major overhaul. Yes, sir, way in the back. Oh, yes, the kidney stone bit. Yes, I'm sorry. That announcement did come at a bad time. The question is, tell about the kidney stone thing. This sailor had kidney stones. The doctor told me that, I am a surgeon, but I don't have the equipment. I can't handle it. You've got to get him help. So he had 3 consecutive attacks. They had him on morphine. At one point, I had him put in my own bunk so we could give him more comfort and keep him, right there under surveillance. And then he would get up and feel all right and go back to work. He was a pretty dedicated fellow himself, but I saw him a couple of times when he was in the throes of this thing, and it was pretty awful. He was really a miserable guy. If anybody's had kidney stones, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, anyway, so we sent a message that we had this problem, and we had to get him help. I knew the Macon was in Montevideo. I'd been told this by some fortuitous event. So I asked, can the Macon come to sea and pick him up? And the answer came back, yes, she would. Now, it so happened that the admiral aboard the Macon was an old squadron commander of mine and good friend, and the skipper of the Macon was a well-known submariner, and I knew that I would have no problems with these characters. The only problem was for us to make contact just on time. And, of course, where? Well, to make real sure that they knew that I knew what we were doing, and for me to make sure that they knew also. I picked a spot to rendezvous, which was directly on top of one of these little pinnacles that the ocean bottom was studded with. And the water depth there mostly was about 10,000 feet, but here it was only 1,000 feet. And so the rendezvous spot was right exactly in the center of this little dot on the chart. And I figured that, by golly, they'd see that. They'd know that that's exactly what we were headed for. So we went at full speed, went to that spot, and there was the cruiser sitting there with all her lights ablaze. And I pulled a fast one on them. We didn't want to surface, but I wanted the signal. So we took the light out of the movie projector, hooked it up with a telegraph key, and took a little tin can, painted it black, put the light inside that, and put that right on the periscope. So I aimed my periscope at the cruiser and sent messages through the periscope with this light. And believe me, that movie projector light, it can be pretty powerful. And it was funny how I was watching through the other scope, and they were receiving the message okay, but they didn't know where to aim the answer. So finally, at one point, the fellow on the flashing light on the cruiser just sent Roger, 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 Roger all around the horizon. And of course, I saw it and received it, no problem. But that's how we got him out. Oh, I just about to say, I'd realized I hadn't said that. How did we get him out? Well, as I told you, I vetoed the business of shoving him out the escape hatch. So what we did is we made an airlock out of the conning tower, and we broached the ship. Now, this is getting part of it out of water. You do that anyway with a snorkel, and you do it also with a periscope, so technically speaking, I felt I was not surfacing. The main part of the submarine remained submerged, and to make super sure, we had it airlocked out so that even the atmosphere wasn't changed. But we got him up into the conning tower, sealed off the bottom, and got him up on the bridge, and the bridge was just about 6 feet out of water, the submarine itself, as I say, submerged. But the deck was just water's edge. rising and falling water coming up and down. We had a crew of people, about 4, with safety tracks on. Because of an earlier accident in submarines, when you send people on deck at sea now, you have to have a safety belt and a track. And this is a chain which hooks onto a track on deck, and you can go back and forth on deck, but you're attached to the ship with this thing. So everybody down on deck had one of these, and he was hooked to the ship and couldn't fall overboard, except for Poole, his name was, the chap with kidney stones. And they were hanging on to him. He was all dressed up in weatherproof clothing and had orders in envelopes written in waterproof stuff in his pockets, and a personal letter from me to the skipper and skipper and admiral on the cruiser, and all sorts of reports and stuff. We asked the cruiser, please, to take care of him, send him back, and to drop all these letters in the mail. Well, the letters were all addressed to the postmaster, New Orleans. When the postmaster, New Orleans, got them and opened them, inside was a letter addressed to somewhere else. And ultimately it got to its addressee, but nobody knew where they came from. That was our stratagem. The sailor with the kidney stones, I later discovered, had no further attacks. Nobody understood how come he was home. He was home. Instructions to lay low and not show his face around the submarine bays, and just say nothing to nobody. And he did exactly as he was told, and nobody knew what he was doing, how he got there, or anything else. But, Poole is home. Don't know. He's there. He won't talk. Well, that's how it was, and he had no surgery so far as I know. But we went around Cape Horn. We debated seriously going through the Straits of Magellan. The question was, did we go through the Straits of Magellan? The answer is no, we did not. We debated going through the Straits of Magellan, but there's a bar there over the entrance on the Atlantic side that we'd have had to cross, and we probably might have had to surface to get across the bar. Furthermore, it all belongs to Chile, and we would have, except for the very entrance, and we would have had to get permission from Chile to go through their inland waters, and the Navy Department decided not to ask. So we didn't go. However, coming through Lombok Strait, we didn't ask either. We simply went, as we had done during the war. And many years later, suddenly a friend of mine sent me an article that he picked up in an Indonesian paper. They had discovered that the Triton had sneaked through their inland waters without asking their permission, and they were indignant, and they wanted the United States government to do something about it. And so far as I know, the United States government hasn't bothered. Yes, sir. We had an inertial navigation system, but it wasn't working. The thing was not any good. We tried, and it was given all the chance it could, but we just had plain navigate by Loran and by a bubble octant device that was built into one of the periscopes. Not too successful, but Loran made it for us. And, of course, our DR, as I said, our DR was excellent. Yes, sir. You. The Ohio class is 520 feet long, displaces almost 20,000 tons submerged. The Triton was 447 and displaced 9,000 tons. So she was a smaller ship. She was much narrower. The Triton submarines are huge things. My father was captain of a battleship in World War I, and he would roll over in his grave if he knew today that submarines were as big as his battleship. Yes. Ah, yes. Thank you for that question. What was the reason for the secrecy? I wondered, of course, I didn't ask question, but I discovered later that what had happened was that the president had made a deal to have a meeting with Khrushchev in May, and that's why I was told we had to be back by the middle of May. And I should have mentioned that, too. We had to be back by the middle of May. So we did. It turned out there had been several other things that were planned at the same time. The whole purpose was for Eisenhower to have this in his back pocket as he went to talk with Khrushchev. And when we got back, the first question they asked me was, have you heard of the U-2? And I said, no, what's that, a new German submarine? Oh, no, not a submarine at all. The U-2 thing had just happened, and we arrived just after the U-2 flap had taken place. And, of course, in a way, it was pretty bad because all the glory had been taken away from us, and everybody was interested in the U-2, and I was sorry for that. But anyway, and also, somebody told me, Jim Haggerty, the president's press secretary, he said of all the things that we planned for Eisenhower to have with him when he went to see Khrushchev, you were the only one that came through. We had succeeded. Everyone else had either not done it, or in the case of Gary Powell, I believe he was going to be one of them too. I think they were going to show pictures. But of course, he'd made a huge fiasco, and some others just didn't get off the ground. So we were the only one of the various things that Eisenhower was supposed to have with him. And that was the whole purpose. That's why the secrecy. The rest of it, in my opinion now, was all just justification. This business of measuring gravity and and all that business was just to make it look good. Yes, sir. How is the atmosphere maintained? Excellent question. Nowadays, submarines simply make their oxygen out of seawater, dump the hydrogen, and they have an absorbent on board that absorbs carbon dioxide. So they maintain their atmosphere just the way they want it to be. In our case, we had no such machine, but we had a so-called oxygen candle we could burn, and it burns and releases oxygen. And we could pump up our carbon dioxide and get rid of it. We didn't have enough, however, to last for the whole 83 days, and so therefore every day about midnight we would come to periscope depth and snorkel for 1 hour, which meant that I put up the snorkel pipe and just changed the air inside the ship. I became very, very expert at keeping track of the oxygen level. The normal oxygen level is 21% by volume. If it gets down to 17%, you feel it, and anything less than 17, you'll conk out. And with all those people on board the ship, we discovered that we could just about go for 24 hours before the oxygen got down to about 18%. You'd certainly feel it at 18%. Cigarettes wouldn't burn. You couldn't light a match. And you'd pant just from walking 3 or 4 feet, pant heavily. This resulted in several stratagems. One of them was, if you increase the pressure inside the submarine, then you had more oxygen per cubic whatever of air that you might. Therefore, by increasing the pressure just a little bit, you felt better. Trouble is that when you put up the snorkel, your pressure had to go right back down to atmospheric immediately so the snorkel could work. And so if say you were near the borderline and had put pressure on to make it feel better, you might have people falling out and going unconscious without any warning whatever before they got enough air pumped back in with a higher oxygen concentration to make them comfortable. So I tried that a couple of times and gave it up as a bad job. We just suffered through the low periods. The worst day was field day. Everybody's up working. Oxygen was used up much faster. Amazing how that happened. Yes, ma'am. Actually, many people have asked a similar question. What we did with all of our spare time, wasn't it boring just to sit there on the side of the submarine and not do anything? Well, let me tell you that there was plenty to do. You're on watch 8 hours out of 24, and you worked 8 hours out of 24, and you slept 8 hours out of 24 theoretically, and you also went to movies, and you also had chow and all that, and you were doing 25, 26 hours worth of something every 24 hours. So there was no boredom. The submariners loved it, and particularly in this ship, they all identified with the idea of going around the world. When we finally got back to St. Peter and St. Paul rocks, I discovered there was a little scuffle taking place up on the forward end of the submarine. And what was happening was that the guys up there were all kind of struggling to be up near the front of the ship so they could be the first man around the world submerged. Yes, sir. Oh, boy. How many pieces of mail did we specially cache? Well, sad to say, early in the game with the nuclear subs, they had announced pretty much what they were doing or planned to do, so it became customary among the stamp collectors of the world to send letters in to be cached and taken on whatever expedition was planned. We got, I think, 4 or 5. Our thing was secret, and all I got was these 5 letters saying, if you do anything fancy with your new ship, why would you mind caching your thing? When we got back, I had mailed out these letters with the cachet on it. There was a letter waiting for me saying, we sent you these things several months ago, and you haven't done anything with them. What gives? Well, then I got another letter a few days later saying, thanks a lot, man. So there were 4 or 5 only of real ones. But at this point, I realized what was going on. And some people think that the round-the-world cruise of the Triton was for the purpose of national policy, and others think it was to measure gravity, but I know it was to satisfy the philatelists of the world. We sent out over 5,000 cachets that we made up ourselves. We used up all the paper on the ship. That's one reason why we ran out of paper for our newspaper. We had to make our own envelopes because we used up all our envelopes. We didn't have the stamps, but we did everything but the stamps.
I had them all registered. I told every sailor, every person on board, that you can send all the letters you want personally. All I want to do is have them registered. So you got to give me, we'll put them in this book. And I've got the book at home. There are over 5,000 registered things that we sent out. And when we got back to New London, I sent an officer to the post office to buy a whole bunch of 4-cent stamps, is what it cost in those days. And we had a task force of sailors putting 4-cent stamps on every one of these things. And then we very carefully canceled them just on the corner of the stamp. And we did all that the very first day. And we raced off and gave them to the postmaster. And the next day, the postmaster came to call on me. Are you a registered naval ship post office? I said, well, no. Well, what's the business of canceling the stamps? Well, I explained, stamp collectors and all that. And, he said, well, that's a no-no. You violated the law. You can go to jail for this. Well, I was a little upset. What do I do now, Coach? But anyway, he said finally, well, understand the situation, and just this once we'll accept them. So the letters were received and sent out, all properly stamped. Incidentally, in the picture where I'm standing with President Eisenhower, I didn't have time to say this during the movie, I had a bunch of papers in my hand. And among them were special letters that we'd cooked up to be delivered to the President, saying, dear Mr. President, we've gone around the world submerged. And the trouble was we not only ran out of paper, we ran out of ink. And so we had to make our own ink. And submariners are quite ingenious. And we made ink, all right. We used glyptol and chopped up carbon and all sorts of stuff. The trouble is the ink wouldn't dry. So there I was with these things for the President. They wouldn't dry, and I was carrying them in my hand. So what I did was I covered them up with toilet paper as a toilet paper. So I had in my hand a batch of toilet paper. And they, right after this session that you saw in the movie, they brought me into the President's office, and he said, how you doing? How and all that. And I said, Mr. President, I brought this for you, and I handed this to him. But I forgot to take off the toilet paper. And he had this funny look on his face. What's this? I think he'd been visited by kooks before. And what's this thing? It goes on. So then I explained all this, and he really broke down. He roared, and he thumped his knees, and he was really having a good time over this, laughing like mad. And this is when I found out about the U-2. Jim Haggerty, right after that, said, what in the world did you tell the old man to make him laugh like that? And I explained my gaffe. And he said, well, that's great. That's the best laugh he's had all week. And that's when I found out a little bit about the U-2 business. Yes, ma'am. We had 2 photographers. Who did the photography? We had 2 photographers aboard. One was a Navy official photographer put there by the Navy, and the other was Joe Roberts from the National Geographic, whom I'd known before, and actually invited him, and the Navy said, fine. They put him on active duty. He was a commander, and he came with us. So we had 2 sets of photographs taken. Part of the problem was this speedy preparation. If I had only had, like a couple of months to think through a lot of things, and a lot better in terms of getting more pictures and more coverage of the whole thing. But we were darn good. Just ship ready and get going in 10 days. So the photography that you see is sort of happenstance. The picture of the young man in the canoe, for example, wouldn't even have been taken if Joe Roberts hadn't been there with me, and he begged and he pled with me, and he said, listen, you will regret it all your life if you don't let me take a picture. Finally I said, okay, Joe, you will so be, and so forth. Go ahead. And, thanks to Joe Roberts that we even have the picture. And, of course, I should have had a movie of it. We could have put a movie on the periscope. We had that set up, and you could plug it in and take it. Failed again. Any other questions? Thanks very much.